Join me with artist Gabrielle Russomagno as she discusses her trajectory from working as an influential portraiture photographer included in the 1991 MoMA exhibition, The Pleasures and Terrors of Domestic Comfort, to her latest solo and collaborative projects that expand to other media. In our conversation, Gabby reflects on coming of age as a feminist, new relationships to productivity when working collaboratively, and analyzing the cycles of life on the individual and universal scale. I'm Joseph Maida, and this is Housed2020. Should we get started?
Yeah, it's so great. Thanks for having me.
It's amazing to see you, and it's great to have a chance to talk and to catch up. I wanted to ask you, Gab, about Pleasures and Terrors, an exhibition that Peter Galassi curated at the Museum of Modern Art in 1991 that you were included in. So much of what I have been influenced by has to do with domesticity as a subject, and this was one of the first catalogs that I acquired, and you were included in this exhibition. And right around the time that I met you and had you as my teacher, you made this contribution to what I would argue is one of the most important photographic exhibitions done at the Museum of Modern Art in the 20th century.
Wow. First of all, thank you. And it's happy news for me to hear that this was an impressive show for you, because it was, at the time, it was super, super radical for Peter to bring this sort of thematic into the museum space. And if you look at that exhibit, I also think it's one of the few times so many females had been included in an exhibition outside of something like Family of Man much earlier in the century. I kind of was invited into that in a strange way. I had just finished graduate school. I had dropped off my work at the Modern to see if they may want to purchase it. It was, for me, an incredibly bold move. I'm not, I don't have artists in my family. I didn't grow up understanding how you professionalize yourself. And so it felt pretty bold. And Peter wrote back and said, we really like this one picture, Jackie and Diana, and we would really like to include it. And I was super chuffed. And what I think was remarkable about that exhibit is it gave a face to so many people, my contemporaries, my female photography contemporaries, who were really, really interested in the domestic realm and in the domicile. And our interests in it were varied, I'm sure, but they all coalesced around this notion that the tiny little moments that we live day in and day out in our private lives are actually the biggest, most epic moments in our lives. And we somehow were all, and I particular, I can speak to myself, we were kind of flipping the notion that, in art, the things you pay attention to are these sort of epic moments. And that just never actually resonated with me. And what I was trying to explore when I think about it, what I was trying to explore was what my coming of age must have been like from a mere distance away from it. So as a young woman growing up as a feminist in an immigrant family, third in line, two older Italian brothers, I kind of had to really assert myself all along to do those kinds of things and have those kinds of opportunities that my brothers had. So having a feminist perspective came very naturally to me, because it was the only way that I was really able to do anything as a first generation American from what was a fairly conservative Catholic background and fairly provincial background. The rhetoric around feminism at the time was women out in the world living lives the way men live lives. And I think what was important about the Pleasures and Terrors of Domestic Comfort was that it allowed us to say we can be feminists and also engage in the domicile in any way that we would like. And even if they were these tiny quiet moments, they were worthy of a place on the big stage of what we paid attention to as a culture. Side by side as the sort of larger epic moments. And so that that was really important to me. And the other thing was that at that time, still very few women were being exhibited in galleries and museums. I think something like 87 or 89% of all the gallery and museum shows when Pleasures and Terrors came out were male dominated. And so to have a show have so many young and emerging female artists and have the focus be the way we move through our domestic realities was actually really pretty radical. And the fact that that has resonated with you and was such an important document, I think is sort of a beautiful thing, because in so many ways, the home or your private life is the beginning of all of the stories we know how to tell and may want to tell. And the fact that it was an inspiration for stories you want to tell in your life years after is actually really great.
So this picture is from a larger series called The Story of Boys and Girls. And I have some here that we can look through. And something that I've always found so powerful and beautiful about this work is that there is a deep psychological engagement with the subject, and the subject are children. And oftentimes when we see children depicted, it's in a one particular light, right? We often, and when we think about subjects that have the potential to so easily fall into cliche, children could be a cliche so easily. You made this work well before you were a mother. But I do think that there is something in the work that speaks to your ability to connect not only with another subject, but with a young person who is a child in terms of their numerical age, but is also seen as a fully formed human being. Maybe not a fully mature human being, but I do feel that you give an agency to the subjects. Could you talk a bit about the experience of working with kids and how you would actually make a picture and how you would engage?
Yeah. So when I was doing this work, it was really clear to me in my mid-20s that I was reflecting back on how it was that I came to be the young woman I thought I was. And in the rush to grow up, and in my own sort of ambitious and intense way that I moved through the world, there wasn't a whole lot of time to take pause, understand who I was, particularly, you know, in coming up. We're all sort of trying on different personalities at all times. But I arrived in my mid-20s and I thought, wait a minute, how did I get here? And I understood, given what I was experiencing as discrimination in graduate school and what I was experiencing as difficulties in being a female working artist at a particular time in high modernism in photography, that I think those things made me just want to come to understand where my grit came from, where my mettle came from, where my challenges were, what I thought was beautiful, what I thought was moving, how sensuality and sexuality develops. When do you come to understand yourself as a person separate from the way your family sees and knows you? I think all of that was swirling around in my head. And to add to that, the way I wanted to work at that time was about going in the world and exploring who I was by finding it in other young people. There was a trend at this moment, so a lot of the tableau photography we see now, these highly constructed fictions, really was a reaction to, was part of like a postmodern reaction to narrative storytelling in the late 80s and early aughts. And I really didn't want to construct the realities. A lot of my peers were in graduate school. It was the hallmark of what was happening at Yale at that time. And for me, the aha moment, that moment of excitement or recognition that happens when something unfolds in front of you that you could have not known, that you could have not seen, and yet in some really true way, it speaks directly to some deep truth you didn't even know you needed to articulate. When that happens in the picture making process, it was extraordinary for me. And so this work was really hard to make. I worked on this body of work for 10 years. And the age range is some very young children, let's say 8 years old to 18, 19, 20-year-olds. So it's actually a wider, age range. And I never engaged the work with an understanding of what it was that I wanted to uncover. I would literally, I mean, this might sound crazy, but I would literally drive around the neighborhoods or walk around the neighborhoods that I lived in, and I would just observe people. And I would, if someone had a particularly unrehearsed way of moving through the world, if there was a way that they were kind of unself-conscious, if there was something about the way they behaved or the moment that I found them in that somehow spoke to something in my memory bank that I wasn't quite aware of but was connecting with, then I would reach out to them. I would talk to their parents. I would introduce myself. I would spend very long periods of time with families and with these children. And so every image that may have worked that ended up in the collection, there are hundreds and hundreds of images and hundreds of hours where I just was a fly on their wall. And I was engaging with them. Sometimes something would happen, and I was quick enough to get the picture. This photograph where the hand is reaching out and the other hand is poised on the sink. That was me being in the right place at the right time and was able to sort of snap it. In others, I would see something that would happen, and then I would say, "Wait a minute, let's go back and see if we can find this again." And it was an enormous emotional commitment that I was able to make at that time in my life. And I think I was figuring out something seminal about who I was as a person, as a way to understand what the next phase of my life was going to look like. What was I committing to? What was meaningful work? Who was I really outside of the din of voices you hear about what you should be doing, what you could be doing? I have never been someone to live life on someone else's terms, and that is a particularly difficult burden to live with, actually. Sometimes I think things would be a lot easier if I just followed someone's advice or did the logical next thing. But so much of who I am and how I work is about finding something that is particular to me at the moment that has a resonance. And so this body of work, when I look back on it, very, very much feels like a diary of the emotional life that I was living when I was growing up, reflected back to me through these portraits that I found in the worlds that I happened to live in at that time. Something like the way it feels. You mentioned that the work feels psychological and these children feel whole, as it were, or fully formed in some way. That makes me happy that you see them that way, because that's how I saw them. Like this little girl playing dress up, and the way it feels when you put perfume on your neck, it is less about the action of putting that perfume on and more about the promise of what that's going to bring you, what it's going to bring you in terms of being wanted, what it's going to bring you in terms of feeling okay in your body, in your skin. Perfume is kind of like an armor. It's something that draws people in. You want someone to be attracted to you because of it, but it's also a way that you protect yourself. It's kind of a shield. And so, I would build lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of frames of these kinds of moments in a life. And then I would sort of sort them for what made emotional sense to me. And there was a decision at some point to then, after spending so much time working with young women, to then start working with young men, because that was a really complicated and fraught thing for me. when you're kind of confident, when you're a young feminist who has ambitions and wants to go out and get something done, boy world doesn't exactly cooperate with you. And as a heterosexual woman, heterosexual men especially don't cooperate with you. And so I didn't fit in anybody's boxes. And when I started working with the young men in this series, it was really to kind of unpack my experiences around what it was like to have older brothers, what it was like to be the really intimidating woman in a room, even though I never felt like I was intimidating. I just always, that's my read, I guess. People have that read of me, but you know me, I'm pretty soft. So this body of work from the time I was, maybe 22 until the time that I was almost 31 or 32 was like a really large chunk of my young creative life.
I think about the complication of this moment. I think about the title of that exhibition, Pleasures and Terrors, because we think about the pleasure part or about the beauty or about those things, but there's also the other side. There's the opposite, right? There's the terror, there's the thing, the complication. And then when I look in at this work, I do think that there is an underlying, in some of the images, maybe terror is not the exact word I would use, but I don't think that while the picture itself may be so beautiful, that doesn't mean that the moment is not incredibly complex, and sometimes even bittersweet, I could say, right? There's a sort of bittersweetness, or maybe a melancholy would be the way to say it.
I think they're all fair descriptions, and I do recognize this work as filled with melancholy and filled with the complications of wanting something and being uncertain about what that is that you want. And I think in almost every picture, it's a description of wanting something. And I was aware of that at the time. And I was also working through that myself. Certain people are really okay with the ambiguity of what life is going to bring you. I needed quite a bit more certainty than that. And for me, being an artist was the most brave thing that I could do. And actually, based on everything else I had done in my life, radical. I mean, it was, I probably would have had a perfectly happy life doing something else where the path forward and the future was more certain, and I would be able to kind of just hit that stuff, right?
Because this is something that you've made recently while we're under quarantine, and I would love to hear you talk about this picture and kind of what prompted you to make the image. It does obviously have a relationship to domesticity and the fact that it feels like a domestic object. But can you tell us a bit more about the work and what you were thinking about?
Yeah, I will. I'll tell you, I have a little studio in the back of the property, and I've spent a lot of time in the last 12 to 15 years doing a different kind of work that relates to I use photography in these big site-specific installations, but I founded 2 different collaboratives. I work with teams of 2 to 4 people. I'm working on something now with 6 people virtually. I'd be happy to talk to you about. So I do a lot of collaborating, and what happens in the collaboration space is really good collaborative artworks are a manifestation of a conversation wherein you don't know where the conversation began. In other words, you start talking, then I'll add to it, then you'll add to it, then I'll add to it. And then in the conversation, we kind of just have this aha moment where we know what we need to be making. And then the thing that you make is really an artifact of a lot of intellectual property, a conversation that you can't quite draw a map of how you got from A to Z. And so my studio is filled with little maquettes of ideas that never got developed, little objects that I love. And since COVID, I've actually been doing a bit of meditating and my yoga practice back in my studio. It's really quiet. I was watching spring come on, like looking at the trees blossom. And it's what I did to keep myself calm at a moment when I was kind of afraid for the world. I wasn't afraid for myself. My family was fine. We all had jobs. We were all working at a pace. It was kind of actually really nice to have everybody home for the first time. Our lives got very, very quiet. And there were really beautiful, good things to come out of that. What I couldn't do was just go make something. I was really struggling with that. It takes a while when you have this buzzy life and you're used to juggling a lot of things, and the kind of creative energy that comes out of that juggling for me is a very particular generative creative energy. When everything quiets down, it takes me a while to relocate myself in the pace of my thinking to understand what it is I'm going to be making. And so every week I was thinking, why am I not making something? Well, I need a project. And it just was unhelpful. And there was this one moment in the studio where I just started looking at the objects that I had been building over the last few years. This is an object that I made. I'm struggling. I'm not struggling. Maybe I am struggling. Maybe that's exactly the right word. But I've been building something for a while that isn't quite fully formed yet. But my loose topic, my loose title is The Secrets Inside. I am always compelled about what's happening in your interior world, in your small, quiet, private lives. That has not gone away. A lot of the work I do in my big collaborative installations are more based on what's happening culturally at large. But when my solo work is always reduces down to these sort of simple, elemental, quiet, little elegant moments and truths that I feel like exploring. And so The Secrets Inside is a series that I've just started building out, where objects take the place of a person, let's say. So this is an artifact, as you said. This is an artifact of the domestic realm, right? It's a little tiny, you can maybe tell the scale of it, right? But it's a toy chair, well designed enough that it could look like a really big chair, or it could look like a toy chair. So the scale thing is like kind of fun and interesting. It's really fun to burn these, and I have been burning a lot of things. The burning being both a cleansing ritual, the burning being, I think of them as smudge sticks, how you like clear out the bad juju energy, but also what happens in the decomposing of material. And I had started this one little chair I was building when I was thinking about wildfires related to climate change. And I was thinking, it'd be really cool if I charred a bunch of furniture and I left them in park areas, in fields, and in random places, and geotagged them, so that when you came upon this object and you were wondering what it was doing, it would be like a little QR code or some geotag that would give you a whole lot of back-end information, sort of moving the information into almost a written space, right? Where the object was the jumping off point. So I made this tiny little object and I was playing with them. And then I since thought, okay, this could be a whole series photographed. And then I thought, what does it mean? When I got to what does it mean, I started thinking about this truncated story of what life had this chair, what life lived in this chair. It is intentional that the space is vacant and the shadow and light create some kind of depth. I wanted the space to feel there and not there. I wanted it to be about an object, and I wanted it to feel like a portrait at the same time. I almost didn't put this in, and to I think what the beauty of Housed2020 is that I almost didn't put this in because I almost never show anything that isn't really finished. You get to a certain point in your career where are you ever putting your sketches of ideas? And so this was a big, it was kind of a bold move. I almost put in a portrait, a domestic portrait, which was beautiful, of my 23-year-old sitting on a counter in two different kinds of stripes on her cell phone trying to figure out her day, right? That would, and I thought that's really what might be expected. but there was something about the haunted nature of this chair, this isolated, lonely, sad, but beautiful haunted chair that just made me want to put it into the mix. And so what I can say to you is that I've been doing a lot of work thinking about how objects can stand in for human experience, and for the portrait itself. I've been thinking a lot about what meaning we imbue an object with. And I know, Joe, we have kind of similar in a way. You've done work with objects that tell stories, and you've made portraits. And I know we both know that the ways they're the same and they're not the same. In this instance, this feels very emotionally similar to every one of the best portraits that I've ever made, but it also feels like it is a bridge between the work I make when I do materials-based kind of sculptural installations and how those objects can find a second life in a photograph. And so for me, this is the first time that I made a picture where two radically different kinds of ways of working and thinking kind of came together in a new third space. That's going to provide, I hope, an opportunity to do more of this work.
It's so exciting to hear you say this, because everything you're saying I responded to in the photograph, and it's amazing to consider that for all of the tragedy and uncertainty and fear in this particular moment of the COVID-19 pandemic, we do have an opportunity to slow down, to take inventory, to understand where we've been, not just in the last few weeks and months, but even over the last few decades, and somehow to make sense of all of that. And I do feel that when I look at this picture, I did first and foremost think it was a portrait. But then I also thought it was dealing with environment, materiality, and then speaking very specifically to the current moment and the emotional complexity of how I'm feeling. I know how so many of us are feeling. So I do think that wrapped up in a seemingly simple image is a very complex, layered narrative. And I think the beauty for me in the picture is that that it at first glance does not show all of the effort. It looks quite effortless. And it's only with spending more time with it that I actually understand the complexity, not only of the four sort of legs that are so tensely placed on the ground, but then the burn of the material, the ways in which things are not as perfect as they at first seem.
I like the way that one leg is barely kissing the floor. So you have like three solid legs and this one that's just hovering above a pinpoint. For me, the whole photograph revolves around the tension of that tiny little moment. You know what's so interesting about working as an artist, once you've done a body of work that someone kind of knows you for, is how can you continue to make what you want to make at any given moment, even if it lacks the kind of fullness or resolve that our longer term projects have. What I really liked about Housed2020 and the way it is just this big aggregate of responses is that it's really important not to see things always so finished and perfect. I actually had more anxiety about what am I going to put into this cohort than I would have if I had been working on something for a long time, had a lot of time to think about it, had context, had many images to look at. So for me, I was able to make an image that spoke to the totality of what the whole Secret Inside project will be about. And I know that if you hadn't put that call out to the SVA community, I wouldn't have had the opportunity to struggle with the beginning of something new that gets me really, really excited.
Well, that's
and so,
I'm glad
yes,
in some ways be the prompt, right?
It was a prompt. And you know, I had just several pieces of little furniture things that I picked up at flea markets. And then because, you know, we had time on our hands, I bought every really interesting, beautiful, domestic, burnable artifact on eBay that I could find over the course of, 4 weeks. So I have a treasure trove of stuff to explore with.
I mean, it gives me great joy to know that in some ways this call and my initiative prompted you, because in so many instances in my own history, you've prompted me, right? And there's a beauty to that reciprocity. There's a beauty in the ways in which in this moment when we're physically apart from the people that we care the most about, the people we have the longest relationships with, other than the immediate family that we cohabitate with, that even though that's all happening, there are ways that we can work collectively and still actually motivate each other, engage each other. And that brings me to want to talk about something that's also been so much part of your practice, you know, in the time between the work you were making in the 1990s and early 2000s and the current things that you're working on. Collaboration has been so much a central core in all of the work that you do. So could you talk a bit more about collaboration as a subject?
I will. Thanks for asking that question. And I think before I talk about how we collaborate, how I have collaborated, it's important to know why I needed to start collaborating. So, you know, the early part of my career, let's pretend I've had 3 chapters so far. The early part of my career was the work that you saw in Pleasures and Terrors, but it's the story of boys and girls. And once I got past that, you know, life happened, got married, you know, I had a child, I was teaching art full time, and I had less time to just really dedicate to making things. And the way that I loved to work, I didn't have the emotional bandwidth to do anymore. I couldn't go out in the world and spend weeks and weeks and weeks with people, getting to know them, disarming them, finding the truth in their life, trying to record it respectfully, having it reflect my own experience. I couldn't do that while I had my own infant, my own toddler, my own child that I had to invest in. I was like really tapped out. And I had a kind of a crisis for a bit, I have to be honest with you, because by the time I came out of the fugue state of having an infant and a young toddler, the whole world of photography had changed. It went from far more of a materials practice. I love the darkroom. I love the red light. I love that time stops. I love listening to water all day long. I love the smell of chemicals, the ways in which time happens in that space. And for me, the sensuality around making in that space kind of all went the way of the dinosaur. And in my commercial work, everyone wanted it digital. They didn't want, you know, and so I was really at a loss because the way I was working, I couldn't work anymore. And the materials I wanted to work with weren't something that anyone was willing to pay for anymore. And so I just started working in sculpture, which is, you know, I was trained in painting and drawing and sculpture and photography. So I had a really full, robust training in the arts. And I was lucky to have a different kind of skill set that I could engage when I didn't know what I was going to make anymore as a photographer. And what I think is so good about that, and I talk about this with students all the time, is it's important to have several things going on creatively, because when work stops in one area, you can move sideways and do work in another area. And you're someone who does a lot of writing, right? And so when you may not be feeling inspired with your photography, you could always write, or you could curate, right? So having multiple areas of where you create, I think makes sense. So I had been, you know, let's go back to 2008, 2007, which was the first major call to action around climate change. I had a young child. I was really scared and thinking, what's going to happen in the world? And I just thought, you know what, I think this is relevant subject matter. I think it's really important to do work that's about social and politically relevant things. But I didn't know how to do that by myself. And I also didn't know how to do it outside of a conversation with other people that I respected and trusted. And I also didn't know how a photograph could, on its own, deal with the level of complexity at which I was understanding this. And so I'm not saying it couldn't do all that. What I'm saying is that I didn't know how to make it do all that. And so going sideways, I was able to work with a sculptor and a technologist and a brilliant musician that I had come to know over time. And I kind of tossed it out there. Are you guys interested? Because they all also had children around the same age as me. And they were all professors at different art schools. And I'm like, am I the only one who isn't getting anything done? Because I need 50 more hours a week. They're like, oh my God, we're so there. And so I started collaborating because I wanted to switch subject matter, and I didn't know how to like jam the way I was working as a photographer into that. And I needed to work smarter, not harder. And so I collaborated first as a team of people with different skill sets who could all do a piece of the lifting. Once we, another way to say that, they all had their own kind of deliverable. And so we were getting really, really big projects done 1 and 2 years out that would have taken me 8 years on my own. And so there was a bit of efficiency about it, I have to say. So that's how it started. But then it was amazing because I understood the power of what it's like to thought partner around complex ideas with other trusted visual and creative people. And that's when I came to understand a new relationship to ownership. When you're a solo artist, the thing you do is the thing you own. It is a reflection of you. It is a part of your professional life, right? It's your IP. It's all of that. When you're working in a collaborative and you can't tell who started the conversation and what was and who ended it, and how the thing even got built. I mean, it's hard to describe, but sometimes you don't even know how the thing got built because you're like, we can do this, and then 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 you're doing all of it. And you're like, that amazing thing would have never existed in my own head. And so collaboration allowed me an opportunity to remove my ego from the work. When my ego was removed from the work, I was able to think both more broadly, more dynamically. I was also able to think more strategically. It also made me understand the value of super brains. This is what I call a super brain. Like my collaborative teams that I work on really work well because no two people replicate the same skill set. Mm-hmm. So to do some of the stuff that I have done over the last 12 years, I would have had to go and get a new degree to learn every new fancy thing. Like just even, can we talk about it? Wiring a site for a multimedia installation, just whatever. Or like, CAD designing object forms that you then, marry images to that rotate in the digital space like a live object. I mean, you were one of the first people that saw Echo, 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 which was one of the first pieces I did as a collaborative. And so it was really great to pass that off and have the full faith that someone was going to return with their part of the project masterfully executed. And so the other thing about collaboratives is that when they're really broad, they're one thing. When they're really narrow, you have to be 100% certain that everyone's delivering at your level of expectation. And that is kind of hard to find. What I'm working on now, the first collaborative that I founded kind of morphed into the Love and Russomagno project. It's the LR collaborative. And what we've been doing is we've been working with scientists to materialize their science data into different art projects. So this was one of our first projects called A Quick and Tragic Thaw. And on the heels of that, we reached out to different, the woman who directs the Science History Museum in New York, Elizabeth Rush, who was just on the short list for the Pulitzer for Rise. She's a kind of creative nonfiction writer. Nancy Campbell, who's a poet laureate in Britain and just won the Ness Award for Library of Ice, and several other artists that we've worked with. And we wanted to explore the theme of living with worlds as they end. And it was all really around climate change. And we knew we wanted an end goal of a big exhibit. We knew we wanted a companion catalog with writing, but we all had just recently been introduced to each other. So we used a year-long folio project to get to know each other. And this is a website where it shows you the folios by artist and by sequence. And so each of us began with a blank folio, made the first page and shipped it to the next person in a kind of round robin fashion. Once this was completed, we were going to meet in Britain, talk about it, make new work, and then find a way to exhibit it, except COVID happened. And because of that, we decided to expand our understanding. Let me just jump to folios for a minute. To expand our understanding of what living with worlds as they end mean, and to begin to incorporate the pandemic, the life in the pandemic, and the uncertainties that that also kind of creates. And so right now, the kind of quick sketch of our lives in COVID live in this content area called Shelter in Place. And each of us are posting daily from our studios. This is, talk about just a prompt without any kind of curatorial criteria. It's very much a knee-jerk reaction to what we're seeing and thinking about every day. When we come together, and we'll begin a virtual residency among this group next week, we'll be meeting for 5 days. We'll have a Zoom call to jump off to start every day, and we'll have a call at the end of the day, and then we'll have working groups and opportunities to communicate about what we're making. And the idea is we're each going to come up with a body of work related to the theme we've been thinking about for a year and where we currently are at this moment with the pandemic. So it also made me a really excellent project manager. And being a good project manager made me a better teacher. And
I was going to ask you this, yeah, the teaching part, because I was also going to ask you in terms of being someone who's taught for a long time and who's taught in a way that I would argue is through the act of sharing and generosity, right? It's really wanting for your students to be able to, that the sort of the testament to how good you are as a teacher is how good your student becomes, right? That they could even essentially reach your level.
They should be besting you. You know, I think this.
And I think this too.
Right?
Right, the idea that if a student surpasses you because of your instruction, it means that you've done a phenomenal job as a teacher, right?
Yes,
and
it means you've actually done the job you were charged with.
And do you find that in some ways, all of your years of being a great teacher has informed your ability to be a great collaborator? Do you think there's a difference between the two?
Yeah, so I think of collaborative teams, I think of classrooms, I think of any kind of partnership as a unique ecosystem. And then you think, what do ecosystems need to survive, right? They need transparency, they need mutual respect, they need a sense of anything can be possible and we're better together, right? They also require real honesty and trust.
I mean, what you're saying right now sounds like, I think, the recipe for a brilliant portrait photographer. And when I look back to the story of Boys and Girls, everything you just said speaks to why that work is so strong. I mean, I now understand that your subjects really trusted you. They really understood you. You understood them. There was mutual respect. There was mutual trust. There was mutual engagement. Both parties were 100% involved.
Right.
So maybe what you're saying is really also the recipe for what makes your early portraiture so powerful. I mean, it seems like if there were ever a moment that perhaps the crisis that we're collectively facing could prompt that, one would hope, right? That would be a best case outcome.
That would be a best case outcome. So when you ask, how is art going to change? I'm wondering if being in lockdown for so long just builds up a kind of rabid appetite to just be in the world. And the fact that we have had to get patient, even if we don't have deep well springs of it, because we've had to figure out how to deal with our anxiety around a lack of certainty. We're practicing those habits of mind now. I think that when we can go back out in the world more fully, wanting to engage more fully in the world, and also wanting to be more present with it. And maybe getting out of the ghetto of our own circular thinking about art, my style, which I think a lot of our young kids really struggle with. they're not asking themselves, who am I? What do I want to say about the world? What's worth making a meaningful comment about? They maybe start to ask themselves that question as seniors. Maybe it's the purview of an MFA program. I think we need to double down on that on the first day of class. They're really concerned with, how am I going to make an impact? What is my style? How does it look different than everybody else's? How do I generate clicks and likes? Those things that I understand have a role and can be very important in building a career, but are not the only things you need to be concerned about, so that 40 years from now, you have a rich, creative, intellectual life and you're still able to make work. You know, my fear is that we're constantly chasing some kind of more shallow understanding of what being good looks like, being kind of, for lack of a better word, kind of notoriety, finding notoriety and celebrity because of your work. I think the rampant ways that there's a lot of, I guess, I don't know what the word is, like a kind of aesthetic visual plagiarism that's happening. You know, I wonder how many people have stolen your ideas. I wonder how many people have stolen my ideas. In some way, being able to see more of everything allows you to be more of a dilettante, because you can just borrow what someone else figured out that was built on many, many years of struggle, trial, error, deep thinking, intellectual rigor. Do you know what I'm saying?
The hope is always that in the conversation, we both learn something, right? Because if we both come out of this with something that we didn't think about before, I mean, I definitely learned something about your work that I didn't maybe connect before. I feel that for me now, having had this conversation, the arc of your work makes such kind of sense, and it all feels like a cohesive, committed practice that reiterates why it's so important to not just think about what you're doing at a particular moment, but as an artist to commit to a life of art making, that it's the entire trajectory, and that if you stay the course, that wherever you are at any moment is the sum of all of the efforts, and really then you reap all of the rewards, everything that you've learned from the very beginnings until the current moment.
And it's actually exactly where you're supposed to be.
Right, because I think this is what maybe that is the most important thing for young people to hear, is that, and by young I mean very, very young people that are in school at this moment, to understand that if you really do stay the course and that you're committed, that you will end up where you're supposed to be, and you have to trust the people that are teaching you, the people that are supporting you, and maybe most importantly, trust yourself. Trust that thing in yourself that other people might disparage, other people might knock down, and their motivations for doing it could be jealousy, could be not understanding you. But if you really trust that moral compass, or that kind of essence of who you are, that you will end up exactly where you're supposed to be.
Joe, I just want to thank you for inviting this conversation. You know, it's a rare opportunity to go back into your creative work with a structured conversation that someone else has sort of put to you because they've been thinking about something. You know, the fact that I had no idea that Pleasures and Terrors resonated so much with you. And when I think about your work, I can understand why. I mean, your work has always been, among my very favorite work made. I think you are, we have a similar understanding of what humanity looks and feels like, and wrapped in a particular love of things beautiful and elegant. And so I'm going to go back to that work and look at it from your perspective, because I think it will tell me how to move forward with Secrets Inside and some of this sort of, I'm going to call them sketches, the start of a project about using objects.
Oh, that's so amazing to think about, because it's interesting at this moment. I mean, I've actually been finding that I am looking back at my own work, but as I'm sure you know, that's really hard to do. It's much easier to look back at the work of people whose work you really admire, to try to learn something else at this moment that maybe my much younger self, when I saw your work in Pleasures and Terrors, I mean, I could understand the beauty, the magnificence, the craftsmanship, the psychological intensity, all of that I understood, but I'm not the exact same person I was when I first saw that work. And so there's something new for me to learn in revisiting it. And so I'm also going to now look back at my work, maybe the work that I made when I first met you, which in many ways
Oh,
was influenced by our exchanges and by your teaching pedagogy and how you approached the darkroom. So I think there is, I mean, the hope with these conversations is that we both grow together and that somehow that inspires anyone who sees it.
thanks, Joe. I mean,
Yeah.